Whitton. Could you please look at the screen? Dr. Edward Whitton was born in 1951 in Maryland in the United States. He was the eldest son for his family, having one younger sister and two younger brothers. When his childhood, there was a space race. Because of that influence, Doctor wanted to become an astronomer. These are Dr. Whitton's parents. His father was a physicist, have taught him math earnestly, and his mother was a pianist, played a lot of beautiful music at home. This is the high school student's time of Dr. Witten. He was interested in politics. Once he aimed to become the journalist, however, he believed that his talent is the math and the science. Therefore, he went to the graduate school of Princeton University and majored in applied mathematics. Later, he changed the major to physics and obtained a doctorate degree. In 1980s, regarding the superstring theory, there was a big debate. Essence of superstring theory means that the smallest unit for the world is not the dot, but a very small string. In this theory, there were some incomplete portions. However, Dr. Witten was strongly attracted and actively pursued his research. Later, many researchers accumulated researches, and several kinds of different superstring theory was presented. But Dr. Witten presented a more comprehensive M theory. This theory gave the good stimuli for the researchers, leading to the newer researches. In 1990, Field Award, which has the highest award in mathematics, was awarded to Dr. Witten. Second from that left is Dr. Witten. Dr. Witten was the first physicist to have won that prize. Dr. Witten saw through the mathematical structure behind the physical phenomena, and he made a great contribution for development of the physics, but not only for that, but also he contributed a lot for the mathematics. Triggered by Dr. Witten's work, a lot of engagement interchanges was started between physicists and mathematicians. He is highly appreciated because he has made the renaissance between pure mathematics and theoretical physicists. Even today, at the Advanced Institute of the Princeton, he is doing the research for the superstring theory with open mind and bold ideas. Doctors gave us the advice for younger people. The opportunities of learning should be taken, and in accordance with that, you should challenge the unknown world. 3 children of Dr. Witten and their families are taken in this picture. Lower right is his wife, also the physicist. This is his 4th visit of Kyoto. The first one was 1990. Dr. Witten said that he has a lot of fond of memory together with his wife. He would like to enjoy his stay. Today, Dr. Witten wants to review his own life, at the same time how he walked a path to become his own research that will be explained by Dr. Witten himself. And the title is The Adventures in Physics and Math. Now, Dr. Witten, please.
So first I want to thank you give thanks to again to the Inamori Foundation for this wonderful prize and for all the kind words, including those in the video. And I also want to thank the staff of the Inamori Foundation for all the hard work that has gone into making this such a wonderful event for all of us. Now I'm going to spend the time today to tell you about the early stages in my career and how I developed as a mathematical physicist, how I developed my interests in physics and mathematics, and how I gained the outlook that I have today. From a very young age, as you actually heard in the video, I was interested in astronomy. This wasn't unusual because I was growing up in the 1950s, which was the period of the space race, and everybody was interested in space. At the age of about 9 or 10, I was given a small telescope, and one of the highlights of my growing up was to see the rings of Saturn. But something that puzzles me in hindsight was that as a child I thought it was very hard to find Saturn. By now I've helped several young children with small telescopes of their own, and I'm quite aware that Saturn is something you can easily see, one of the brightest objects in the sky that's easily visible from any place on Earth when it's above the horizon. It won't look like it does in a professional picture, like this one, but it will still be a striking sight through any telescope. As a youngster, I dreamed of growing up to be an astronomer, but I was also very much afraid that by the time I was ready to do my work in astronomy, an astronomer would have to live and work in space. This sounded dangerous to me. Looking at how things have turned out half a century later, we can see that space satellites are very important in astronomy, but the astronomers who use them are working on their ground. I suppose the repair of this Hubble Space Telescope by astronauts was one of the very few cases in which work important for astronomy has been performed by humans actually working in space. But while space telescopes have become very important, many of the most important observations are still made from telescopes on the ground. At about the age of 11, I was presented with some relatively advanced math books. My father is a theoretical physicist, and he introduced me to calculus. For a while, math was my passion. However, my parents were a little reluctant to push me too far, too fast with math as they saw things. So it was actually a long time after that before I was exposed to any math that was really more advanced than basic calculus. I'm not sure, in hindsight, whether that attitude was best or not. However, the result was that for a number of years, the math I was exposed to did not seem fundamentally new and more challenging than what I had seen as an 11-year-old. It's hard to know to what extent this was a factor, but at any rate, for a number of years, my interest in math flagged. Eventually, however, I understood that physics and math were the fields in which I had the greatest talent, and that I would really only be satisfied with a career in those fields. I was about 21 years old when I made the decision between mathematics and theoretical physics, and I made this decision based on very little knowledge about either field. My choice was theoretical physics, in large part because I was fascinated by the elementary particles. This was in the early 1970s. For a 20-year period, which had begun roughly when I was born, there had been an amazing succession of discoveries about elementary particles. At the beginning of this period, the proton and neutron and the atomic nucleus were the smallest things that were known. The modern concept of elementary particles barely existed. But beginning around 1950, there had been an explosion of new discoveries. This had resulted mostly from new technologies, especially, but not only, the ability to make particle accelerators in which elementary particles are accelerated to very high energies. In short, when I started graduate school at Princeton University in 1973, the study of elementary particles had been in a state of constant tumult and upheaval going back at least 2 decades. But beneath the surface, there was the potential for change. What we now know as the standard model of particle physics had been written down in essentially its modern form in a long process that was essentially completed just a few months actually before I started graduate school by David Gross, Frank Wilczek, and David Politzer. David Gross, who is pictured here, was later to be my advisor in graduate school. The period of perpetual revolution in elementary particle physics actually continued during my student days. One of the biggest discoveries of all was announced on November the 11th, 1974. This was the discovery of the so-called J-psi particle. Though its lifetime is far less than a nanosecond, it was astonishingly long-lived for a particle of its type. It was such a dramatic discovery that it led to a remarkably speedy Nobel Prize for the heads of the teams that made the discovery. And people used to talk about the November Revolution in physics. To those of you who are too young to remember the Cold War, or who might want to brush up on your history books, let me just remark that there's another event that used to be called the November Revolution. Anyway, by November 1974, I had learned just enough about elementary particles that I could understand what the excitement was all about and what people were saying, but not quite enough to participate prominently. After what looked like some initial confusion, it was realized in a few days that the J-psi particle was made from a new kind of quark. As I say, it looked to me like this realization followed a few days of initial confusion, but it may be that things were clearer even sooner to the senior professors, and their understanding just took a while to filter down to us students. I've gone into so much detail about this to try to help you understand what matters were like during my student days. In short, when I was a graduate student, an era of perpetual revolution in particle physics was in full swing. It had been going on for 2 decades, and I assumed it would continue, and I was hoping to participate in it. But in hindsight, the quick success in understanding the J-psi was perhaps a hint that the scientific landscape was going to change. In fact, it turned out that the surprising properties of the J-psi particle actually made sense in the context of the standard model of particle physics. And they had even been predicted before, but I'm not sure how well known the papers making this prediction had been. Certainly I, and I think my fellow students, had not known about those papers. Meanwhile, I developed another interest as a student, which in a way contained some of the seeds of my later work. Here I should explain to those of you who are not physicists that one side of what physicists do is to try to understand the laws of nature, what are the laws of nature, and the other side is to try to solve the equations in particular situations and predict what will happen. The separation between those two sides of the subject is not always clear. For example, there's no hope to learn what are the correct laws of nature unless one has at least some ability to solve them and find their predictions. But in practice, much of what physicists do is to try to understand the behavior of matter in situations where, at least in principle, the fundamental equations are known. This can be easier said than done. For example, it's one thing to know the Schrödinger equation, which is the quantum mechanical equation that describes the behavior of electrons in atomic nuclei. It's quite another thing to solve the equations and understand the behavior of a piece of copper wire. As a particle physicist, my goal in principle was to understand what are the fundamental equations. However, the emergence of the Standard Model created a novel situation. There were some very new fundamental equations in the Standard Model that had just been established as I was beginning my graduate days. And some of them were really very hard to understand. In particular, the Standard Model said that protons and neutrons and the pions, which had been first proposed by Hideki Yukawa here in Japan, and other strongly interacting particles, are made from quarks, but no quarks were to be seen. To reconcile this contradiction, one had to believe that quarks are confined, meaning that no matter how much energy one pumps in, quarks can never be separated. So since this question was important then and later in my career, I have provided here a short movie that illustrates it. The red and blue balls are quarks, and, well, the observation starts now when they coincide. Energy is pumped in and they separate, but somehow a tube of energy forms between them, slows them down, and they snap back together. So this was, when I was a student, more or less the result of real experiments, and eventually it became possible to do computer experiments that show that this phenomenon is real. But it's a very difficult phenomenon to understand. The equations that are supposed to describe it are known. They are the equations of the Standard Model, but it's very difficult to solve them, and these equations are very opaque. So it was hard to understand if the Standard Model really would account for this phenomenon of quark confinement that one tries to illustrate with this movie. Understanding quark confinement became my passion as a student and for a number of years afterwards. But it was a very hard problem, and I did not make much progress. In fact, in its pure form of demonstrating confinement exactly in the context of the Standard Model, the problem is really unsolved today. To be more precise, from large-scale computer calculations, we know that the result is true, but we do not really have a human understanding of why. I gained a couple of things from this experience, even though I was not able to solve the problem I wanted. One thing I learned was negative. I learned the hard way what I regard as one of the most important keys to doing research. One needs to be pragmatic. One cannot have too much of a preconception of what problem one aims to solve. One has to be ready to take advantage of opportunities as they arise. Reluctantly, I had to accept that the problem of quark confinement was too difficult, and to make any progress at all, I had to lower my sights considerably and work on much more limited problems. As I'll explain later, I eventually made a small contribution to the problem of quark confinement, but that was 20 years later, and a lot of other things had to happen first. In a more positive note, in accepting that quark confinement was too difficult and making what progress I could on more limited problems, I began to get some experience in thinking about what physicists call the strong coupling behavior of quantum systems. That means the behavior of quantum systems when the equations are hard to solve by standard methods. This experience became important in my later work. Here I should explain to you, to those of you who are not physicists, that if you go to a graduate school in physics, you'll be taught standard methods to solve the equations of quantum physics when the quantum effects are small, when the coupling is weak, to use the jargon. When the coupling is strong, when the quantum effects are big, a large variety of questions and methods come into play. As a result, I'm not sure there is any such thing as being an expert on how quantum systems behave for strong coupling. And in any event, certainly I've never become such an expert myself. I've learned quite a bit while always feeling like a beginner. In 1976, I completed my PhD at Princeton University, and I moved to Harvard University in Massachusetts for what proved to be 4 years of postdoctoral work. It was also a very eventful time personally. Karen Appy, whom I married in 1979, arrived at Harvard as a postdoctoral fellow at the same time that I did. We had met at a summer school in the French Alps in 1975. She was invited to Harvard by a distinguished mathematical physicist, Arthur Jaffe, and our first child, who you actually saw in one of the photos in the video as a grown woman, was born just before we left Harvard in 1980. At Harvard, I learned a lot from many of the senior professors, originally from the physicists, but later from the mathematicians as well. I don't want to go into too much technical detail, but I want to give you a flavor of some experiences. So Steve Weinberg was one of the senior professors in the physics department at Harvard. He was a pioneer of the Standard Model and won the 1979 Nobel Prize for that work. There were certain fundamental problems in physics that I had had trouble understanding when I was a student. And I think that Steve believed that many of the physicists had some of the same confusions I did. At any rate, whenever one of these topics would come up in a lecture or discussion, he would always give a small speech explaining how he understood things. After hearing these speeches a number of times, I myself gained a clearer picture. I also learned a lot from two other Harvard colleagues, Shelley Glashow and Howard Georgi. I want to tell you, I'm showing you relatively recent pictures, so you have to imagine Howard Georgi at the time was a young man, and Shelley was probably in his mid-40s. These pictures are taken later. Glashow was a senior professor and also a pioneer of the Standard Model, and he also shared the 1979 Nobel Prize for that work. Georgi was a junior faculty member, just a few years older than I was. Office space was scarce at Harvard, and Georgi and I shared a fairly small office. Glashow and Georgi, among other things, were experts at building models to explain the results coming from particle accelerators. I learned a lot from them, and they had many interesting new models in those days, which had a big influence on the development of physics later. If the age of perpetual revolution had continued, I probably would have aimed to learn to specialize in doing what they were doing. But as I have already hinted, the nature of experimental progress was changing at just this time. Great advances have continued in areas ranging from neutrino physics to cosmology. Important new particles have been discovered, most recently the Higgs particle, found at the CERN laboratory in Europe 2 years ago. But rather than perpetual revolution, the biggest surprise from particle accelerators has been the fantastic success of the Standard Model, which proves to work much better and at much higher energies than I suspect any of its inventors must have anticipated. Although I certainly did not realize this at the time, the changing landscape meant I would find more opportunity in somewhat different directions. That's why my interaction with yet another one of the senior physicists at Harvard, Sidney Coleman, proved to be important. He was a legendary figure for his insights about quantum field theory, and was the only one of the physicists I've mentioned who was actively interested in strong coupling behavior of quantum fields. In other words, in understanding what happens when the lessons you're taught in graduate school are not enough for solving the equations. The others appeared to regard such questions as a black box not worth thinking about. On a number of occasions, Coleman drew my attention to significant insights that I think I otherwise would not have learned, or certainly not in those days. Often these involved fundamental mathematical ideas about relativistic quantum physics or its relation with topics in modern mathematics. There are many topics that were important in my later work that I had simply no inkling of until I learned them from Coleman. At the time, I often could not make much sense of what I was hearing, but luckily I remembered it enough that it was useful later. Just to give one example, I can remember Coleman explaining to me an insight originally due to the Soviet mathematician Albert Schwartz, or at least he was a Soviet mathematician. He moved to California after the end of the Cold War. So Schwartz had discovered that surprising insights of physicists working in their standard model actually had their roots in the index theorem of Michael Atiyah and Isidore Singer. This was actually a major theorem of 20th century mathematics. Here I show Singer and Atiyah receiving the Abel Prize from the King of Norway in 2004, largely because of developments arising from their fundamental theorem. At the time, I'd never heard of this theorem or even the concept of the index or of the names Atiyah and Singer. To explain this better, I should tell those of you who are not physicists or mathematicians that in the 17th, 18th, and even much of the 19th centuries, mathematicians and physicists tended to be the same people. Newton, for example, was certainly both. But by the 20th century, the two subjects had appeared to go their separate ways. In part, this happened because mathematics made advances that seemed to take it far away from physics. But also, conversely, it happened because physicists, after about 1930, were moving in directions involving relativistic quantum field theory that were very difficult to understand mathematically. My graduate education in physics had occurred at a time when there was not much engagement between cutting-edge mathematics and physics. Like the other physics graduate students I knew, I had not learned the sort of things one would need if one wished to grapple with contemporary questions in mathematics. It was typical of a physics graduate education at the time that I had never heard of the Atiyah-Singer index theorem or most of the other things that I heard about from Coleman. But meanwhile, during my Harvard days, developments such as the role of the Atiyah-Singer index theorem made some of the prominent mathematicians curious about what physicists were doing. And as a result, in the second half of my Harvard days, I was learning a lot from some of the mathematics professors at Harvard. Perhaps most importantly, Roald Barthes and David Kazan, who are pictured here. I also got to know Michael Atiyah and Isidore Singer. Atiyah invited me to visit in Oxford in the winter of 1977-8 for the first of what proved to be many visits. Atiyah and Singer were important influences in my later work. I was interested in what the mathematicians had to say, and I certainly learned a lot of new things from them. At the same time, I was reasonably skeptical of whether the mathematicians could shed light on the physics problems I was interested in, like the problem of Quark confinement, which was the subject of that little movie. In fact, I wasn't entirely wrong in being skeptical. The renewed interaction between mathematics and physics that was beginning in the late 70s has proved to be far more robust and significant than I anticipated at that time, and also far more important in my own work than I understood back then. But it's remained difficult for mathematicians to grapple with quantum field theory, and the importance of mathematics for physics, of modern mathematics for physicists, has come mainly because of new questions that have emerged from the physics. Only gradually I started to see a payoff from what I'd been learning from the mathematicians. At first, each time this happened, it seemed like an exception. I'll describe one of the first instances. This occurred soon after I joined the faculty of Princeton University in 1980. I was interested in supersymmetric field theories, which seemed to have the potential to solve some problems left open by the standard model of particle physics. I was puzzled in trying to understand the nature of the vacuum in these theories. The behavior I found was simpler than seemed to be explained by standard ideas of physicists. Trying to get to the bottom of things, I kept thinking about simpler and simpler models, but no matter how simple the model was, it always had the same puzzling behavior. After pondering this for a long time, I eventually remembered, and I think this happened while I was in a swimming pool in Aspen, Colorado in the summer of 1981, eventually I remembered a lecture I had heard by Roald Barthes, who's pictured here on the left. about 2 years before. At a physics summer school in the French island of Corsica, Bott had given a group of physicists a basic introduction to a topic in mathematics known as Morse theory. Morse theory had been fundamental in Bott's own work, but I'm sure that, just like me, the other physicists listening to his lecture had never heard of it and had no idea what it might be good for in physics. And I'd probably not heard of Morse theory again since that day, until 2 years later in 1981, when dimly managing to remember just part of what Bott had told us, I realized that Morse theory was behind what I'd been puzzling over. So I realized on that day that Morse theory explained the problem in physics that was bothering me, but you can say the same thing in reverse. You can say that one could apply the tools of the quantum physicists to get a new understanding of Morse theory. So my paper linking these topics is this one, called Supersymmetry and Morse Theory. And while originally my motivation was to understand supersymmetry, the paper has probably been more important for its influence on Morse theory. It's probably the first paper I wrote that's well known in the mathematics world, or at any rate, it's better known than the papers I wrote earlier. This is actually a fairly typical example of how my work from that period, roughly 30 years ago, was related to mathematics. I was trying to answer physics questions. The possible mathematical interest was secondary. If the answer to the physics question shed some light on the mathematics, this was a happy surprise. At first, the surprises seemed like isolated cases, not part of a pattern. It took a long time for me to realize there was a pattern. I want to briefly mention a human side behind this paper. Marston Morris, the inventor of Morse theory, starting in the 20s and 30s, had been, from 1935 on, a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where I've spent most of my career. He died at an advanced age in 1977. Here he is, actually. And here he is in 1962. I never met him. But his widow, Louise Morse, remains well and active today at the age of more than 100. Here are Marston Morris and Louise Morse, now his widow, in 1957. I got to know her after my work on Morse theory. She's continued to host gracious receptions for the mathematical community in Princeton until very recently. I think she's now about 103. Now, before saying more about the relation of my work to mathematics, I should tell you something about the major influence in my physics that I've not mentioned so far. This is string theory. The standard model of particle physics describes the interactions of nature that are important for elementary particles, what physicists call the strong, weak, and electromagnetic interactions. Left out is gravity. Gravity is important for stars, galaxies, and the universe as a whole. So, for example, this is a picture from the Hubble Space Telescope showing thousands of galaxies at huge distances in one little picture. And if you want to understand what's going on in this picture, you need to use gravity in the form of Einstein's theory of general relativity. That was Einstein's greatest creation, in which gravity results from the curvature of space-time, and it's our modern understanding of gravity. So, to understand this picture, you need gravity and general relativity. But if you want to understand atoms, molecules, and subatomic particles, you need to work with quantum mechanics. So, for example, quantum mechanics will be important in a lot of what is going on with the chemical substances mentioned in the previous lecture by Professor Langer, but the astronomers will grapple with general relativity. Now, Einstein's work was done before quantum mechanics was in its modern form, and so his theory is a pre-quantum mechanical theory. Updating his theory to take quantum mechanics into account has been a dream of physicists since the 1930s. But it's a tough challenge, and direct experimental clues are scarce or non-existent, beyond the bare fact that general relativity and quantum mechanics both exist and play an important role in nature. Both then and, in my opinion, to the present day, direct attacks on this problem have yielded little insight. That's actually an illustration of something I explained before, the need to be pragmatic in research. One should not have too much of a preconception of what problem one is trying to solve at a given point in time. At a given moment, the time may simply not be ripe to solve a particular problem. Progress on something else may be needed first, and the necessary clue might come from a different direction. In the case of quantum gravity, the unexpected direction was string theory. The physicists who developed the roots of string theory in the late 60s and early 70s were not thinking about quantum gravity. They were trying to understand the force that holds an atomic nucleus together. The theory that these physicists developed was incredibly rich, but it was not entirely correct as a theory of the strong interactions, and it went into eclipse following the emergence of the Standard Model. But in the 1970s, a few physicists, including Joel Shirk, David Olive, and John Schwartz, and here in Japan, Tomoaki Yonea, realized that string theory might actually give the clue to quantum gravity. The basic idea of string theory, before I get to the basic idea of string theory, I do have a picture of myself here with one of the important pioneers of string theory, John Schwartz. This picture was taken in the mountains in Colorado, and I've included it here because through the developments I'll be describing in the next few minutes, he was a very important influence in my work. This picture was taken in the 90s after some of those developments. The basic idea of string theory, to state it most simply, is that an elementary particle is not a point particle, but a little loop of vibrating string. But here we have to think about this quantum mechanically, although it's hard to draw. So the point particle obeys quantum laws. Quantum uncertainty makes it a little fuzzy. And the string is a quantum string. I can't draw it, so I haven't tried to. But you may ask yourself, it seems like such a simple idea to replace a point particle with a loop of string, so why does it lead to something deep? The best simple answer I can give is to remind you of the beauty of music. Like a violin string, one of the strings I study can vibrate in many ways. This is a schematic picture. A violin string is held down at the two ends. It can vibrate in this shape, but also it can vibrate in this shape and in many other shapes. And they give the fundamental tone in music, but also the higher overtones. And in music, the richness of music comes from the interplay of the basic tone with the higher overtones. And if string theory is correct, the unity of the elementary particles comes from this same interplay. In music, the basic tone that you create with a tuning fork sounds harsh to the human ear, and the beauty of the violin string comes from the subtle interplay of the different states of vibration, of which I've drawn the first two. In string theory, the different elementary particles are different states of one string, and the unity of the elementary particles comes from that fact. I'll just very briefly explain in one other way why passing from point particles to strings might give us something deep. Quantum physics is built out of elementary processes in which a particle splits into two, as I've drawn here. And although I haven't drawn it, there's a reverse process in which two particles join into one. Now, that leads to the basic difference between particles and strings. If a particle splits in two, we know when and where it happens. It happens exactly here. But on the right, I've drawn the analogous picture for a string. So one string has split into two, and if you look at the whole picture, you can see that that's happened. But if you look at a small piece of the picture, a small piece looks like any other small piece. So here, there is a definite space-time event where something happens. But here, if you look at the whole picture, you see something happen, but you can't quite see where it happens. So that's a fundamental difference between particle physics and string theory, and it turns out to be the root of very many deep things that we don't completely understand even today. But it's the beginning of the fact that string theory seems to require a substantial revision in our understanding of space and time. By the early 1980s, John Schwartz, my colleague, I showed you my picture with him in the Colorado mountains, was developing this idea with Michael Green and sometimes with Lars Brink, and they were obtaining very interesting ideas. I became aware of and fascinated by what they were doing, But I was reluctant at that time to be involved, in part because I thought that even if the theory is right, understanding it would be an incredibly long-term challenge. Still, I became fascinated, and for example, I spent most of the summer of 1982 trying to learn the theory by reading a review article that Schwartz had written. In those years, though I became reluctant to be wholeheartedly involved in string theory, I did a few things that were relevant. The work of Green and Schwartz and the others had the potential to not just to combine general relativity with quantum mechanics, but to unify gravity with all the forces of the Standard Model. But I realized there was a problem. A theory like they were building was going to have trouble accounting for the peculiar handedness of elementary particles. Technically, this was because of something called anomalies. They had to cancel to make the theory work. I explored this in a paper pictured here with my junior colleague, Luis Alvarez-Gomez. We were not able to solve the problem, but we found something related. We found a new way that anomalies could cancel in one of the string theories. Without trying to explain this in detail, let me just say that even before you try to make a theory of nature, just to make string theory internally consistent, so that it could possibly be a useful theory of nature, depends on a lot of miraculous-looking details that delicately hang together when one looks closely. This internal consistency is a remarkable story and is one of the reasons to believe that string theory should be taken seriously. And with this paper, Alvarez-Gomez and I had made our own small contribution to that story, but the problem of handedness of elementary particles remained. One day in the summer of 1984, I learned that Green and Schwartz had discovered a new way to cancel the anomalies. To me, this was electrifying news. It had been clear to me for several years that the problem of anomalies was the main obstacle to make theories derived from string theory significantly more realistic. It was obvious that one was going to be able to do much better, and this was certainly borne out by work in the following months. Almost immediately I wrote a short paper explaining some of the most obvious points, but a few months later, with several colleagues, I wrote this paper, which was probably a more significant and satisfying effort, explaining how models that capture many of the important properties of elementary particles unified with gravity can be constructed in string theory. So the ability to make semi-realistic unified theories of all the known particle forces in a rather elegant way was important for physics, but it also had an impact on the relation between physics and mathematics because the construction used rather modern ideas in differential geometry in an essential way. In fact, once one took string theory seriously, one soon found a lot of reasons that physicists would have to pay attention to previously unfamiliar topics in mathematics. For example, at a basic level, the string, as it moves in space-time, fills out a two-dimensional surface that has the properties of what mathematicians call a Riemann surface, an important topic in the mathematics of the last century, and important for physicists largely because of string theory. From my vantage point, all this made the interaction of physics with more or less contemporary mathematics far more robust and significant. Opportunities to apply physics-based insights to purely mathematical problems stop seeming like exceptions. In my own work in the years following this, the most significant development probably involves topological quantum field theory. Hints here came from suggestions by the mathematician Michael Atiyah, who I mentioned before, and also from developments in physics. So my work in this direction involved applying physics ideas to problems that traditionally would not have been, problems in mathematics that traditionally would not have been regarded as problems for physicists. They were all problems that I would not have seriously considered working on until string theory had broadened our horizons concerning the relations between physics and mathematics. In each case, I aim to show how a problem that naively is purely mathematical could be approached by methods of physicists. I'll just mention one of these problems, which involved knots. You're all familiar with tangled pieces of string that you run into in everyday life, possibly a tangled shoelace. To a mathematician, a knot is a tangled loop of string, possibly freely floating in empty space, like the one I've drawn there. Probably most of us are not aware that in the last century, mathematicians built a rather deep theory of knots. By the time I became involved, which was in 1987 and 8, there was a puzzle which Atiyah had helped me appreciate. The mathematician Vaughan Jones had discovered a marvelous new way of studying knots, for which he later received the Fields Medal. He had proved his formulas worked, but why they work was a little mysterious. For those of you who are not physicists and mathematicians, the distinction between understanding what's true and understanding why it's true might not be immediately clear, but this difference is actually an important part of the fascination of physics and mathematics, and I guess all of science. I will say, though, that the difference between what and why depends on the understanding one has at a given point in time. One generation might be satisfied that they understand why something is true, and the next generation, from a different vantage point, may feel it's necessary to take a deeper look. But anyway, getting back to knots, I was able to get a new understanding of Vaughan Jones's formulas by thinking of a knot as the path followed by a particle in a three-dimensional space-time. There were a few tricks involved, but much of what I did was simply to apply standard ideas of physicists to a problem that physicists usually had not thought of as a physics problem. Much of the novelty was just to apply the techniques of physicists to a problem that was regarded as a problem in math. This work became one of my best-known contributions among both mathematicians and physicists, but it's also an excellent illustration of something I said in my acceptance speech last night. No matter how clever we are, what we can accomplish depends on the achievements of our predecessors and our contemporaries and the input we get from our colleagues. My ability to do this work depended very much on clues I got from other colleagues. In several cases, I knew of these clues because important work was being done around the corner from me at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, or because visitors to the Institute told me about papers I probably would not otherwise have known about. It also helped, at a certain moment, to remember one of the lessons I'd been told from Sidney Coleman back in Harvard days, involving yet another insight by Albert Schwartz. I've only had the chance to describe some highlights of my experiences in mathematics and physics until about 1980, but I think these highlights are reasonably illustrative. This was my formative period. By this time, I had quite a bit of experience in doing research and had developed something fairly close to my present outlook on many questions. I will not try to give a complete outlook of what happened since then, partly because it would be too long and perhaps because we do not have enough perspective. But I want to say a little bit about what happened in the years 1994 to 5, which I regard as the most productive in my career. By this time in my life, I had spent 2 decades basically working on quantum field theory, but this work involved a sort of split personality. Some quantum field theories were important in the Standard Model, others were important in string theory, and there wasn't much of a link between the two classes of questions and methods. This felt a little strange and made me a little uncomfortable. What happened in 1994 to 5 was that a wider perspective emerged in which all the quantum field theories play a role. Many physicists contributed to this, and there isn't time for a full explanation. My own contributions basically had 2 parts. With Nathan Seiberg, I developed in 1994 what both mathematicians and physicists call Seiberg-Witten theory, though this phrase means rather different things to mathematicians and physicists. I'll explain this in some detail because it reflects the differences in outlook that still exist today between physicists and mathematicians. To physicists, Seiberg-Witten theory was our new way of understanding how certain quantum field theories behave when quantum effects are big. When one is doing research, the trick is always to find a problem easy enough that you can make progress, but hard enough that it's worthwhile to make progress. So that's what Seiberg and I did, was to find a class of quantum field theories where we could actually understand the strong coupling behavior, but where it was interesting enough that that was illuminating. So this was our first paper, and among other things, it enabled us finally to make some progress with this problem that had obsessed me 20 years ago, but when I had really not had the methods to make progress. It's instructive to look back and realize how far out of reach the contribution I eventually made to the quark confinement problem would have been in my student days. And that's a lesson that sometimes we have to be patient. A given problem might not be ripe for solution at a given point in time. My work with Seiberg also had mathematical implications for the study of four-dimensional spaces. And it's these implications that mathematicians usually refer to by Seiberg-Witten theory. This is actually an illustration of the fact that although mathematics and physics in some ways have grown much closer together during my career, the goals, in other ways, they remain far apart. The goals and the tools that the two fields can reliably use are quite different. Mathematicians using the Seiberg-Witten equations together with other techniques have made wonderful discoveries in geometry, but usually without much reference to the quantum side of Seiberg-Witten theory. The following year, drawing among other things on the experience from Seiberg-Witten theory as well as clues from other areas, I proposed a somewhat similar picture of the behavior of string theory for strong coupling, where the standard methods of calculation are not adequate. Actually, a different version of the same picture was in the video that introduced me. This picture shows that there's a richer picture that emerged in the mid-90s, which we call M theory, that has the traditional string theories as limiting cases or specializations. And this richer picture enabled us to get a much wider understanding of the picture. It won't be... So what we learned in the mid-90s was that the different string theories as we'd studied them before are different limiting cases of a single richer theory that we now know of as M theory. And that theory is our candidate for superunification of the laws of nature. The traditional string theories are alternative descriptions of a bigger reality. They each tell part of a richer story. All the quantum field theories in all dimensions are part of this story. I've been often asked why I use the name M theory to describe the richer theory that has the traditional string theories as limiting cases. M theory was meant as a temporary name pending a better understanding that would give us a better name. Some of my colleagues thought the theory should be understood as a membrane theory, and although I was skeptical, I kept the letter M from membrane and called it M theory, saying that time would tell whether M stands for magic, mystery, or membrane. Later, the membranes were derived from matrices, and by a happy coincidence, the word matrix also starts with the letter M, so I would say that M stands for magic, mystery, or matrix. I'd like to conclude by using the last few minutes to briefly explain my view of the significance of the mathematical and physical work that I've been involved in. It actually is more simple to explain my opinion on the mathematical side. Quantum field theory and string theory contain many mathematical secrets. I believe that they will play an important role in mathematics for a long time. For various technical reasons, these subjects are difficult to grapple with mathematically. We hope that those difficulties will be overcome in this century, but for now, these topics are still difficult technically from a mathematical point of view. Until some of the technical difficulties are overcome and the mathematical world can grapple with quantum fields and strings per se, and not only with their implications for better understood areas of mathematics, physicists working in these areas will continue to be able to surprise the mathematical world with interesting and surprising new insights. I've been lucky to be at the right place at the right time to contribute to part of this. On the physical side, though there is no definitive answer, there are many circumstantial reasons to believe that string theory and its elaboration in M theory are closer to the truth about nature than our presently established theories. String/M theory is too rich and its consistency is too delicate for its existence to be purely an accident. Another strong hint is the elegance with which unified theories of gravity and the particle forces can be derived from string/M theory. Moreover, when critics of string theory have had interesting ideas, these have tended to be absorbed as part of string theory. And that's happened repeatedly. Finally, string/M theory has repeatedly proved its worth in generating new understanding of established physical theories, and for that matter, in generating novel mathematical ideas. All this really only makes sense if the theory is on the right track. So in conclusion, I'll just remark that I believe strongly that there are many mathematical and physical discoveries that remain to be made in this area. And for today's young people, there's lots of opportunity to get involved and make important contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Witten. A bouquet of flowers will be presented to the laureate, Dr. Witten. Please give a big applause once again to Dr. Witten. We will now break for 20 minutes.